Hi, Claire. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of Hertfordshire's Growth Board. I'm David Williams and I'm the chairman of the Hertfordshire Growth Board, and I'm joined at this meeting by the 10 leaders of Hertfordshire's district and borough councils, together with their chief executive officers. We're also joined by our co-opted member, Mark Breton, the chair of the Hertfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. A few announcements before we begin. The council will be holding this meeting electronically in accordance with the relevant regulations. In attending this meeting in an electronic capacity, you should note that there is a link to the meeting and that it is available on demand subsequently from hertfordshire.gov.uk website. Meetings of the committee are open to the public. This includes the press, and attendance is welcomed. However, there may be occasions when the public are excluded from the meeting for particular items of business. Any such items are marked at the end of the public part of the meeting and are listed under Part 2, closed agenda. Members are reminded that all equalities implications and equalities impact assessments undertaken in relation to any matter on this agenda must be rigorously considered prior to any decision being reached on that matter. Members are reminded that, firstly, if they consider that they have a disclosable pecuniary interest in any matter to be considered at the meeting, they must declare that interest and must not participate in or vote on that matter unless a dispensation has been granted by the Standards Committee. Secondly, if they consider that they have a declarable interest, as defined in paragraph 5.3 of the Code of Conduct for Members, in any matter to be considered at the meeting, they must declare the existence and nature of that interest. If a member has a declarable interest, they should consider whether they should participate in consideration of the matter and vote on it. So let's turn to the agenda, the Part 1 public agenda, and firstly we have the minutes of our last meeting. The board is invited to note the minutes of the board meeting held on the 26th of January 2021. And if I can ask members please to indicate in chat whether they are for, against or abstaining in support of the minutes, please. Thank you, colleagues. The minutes have been agreed. The next item on the agenda are public questions, and none have been received. Following that, public petitions under Standing Order 13, none have been received. And so we come to the first substantive item on the agenda, the Growth Board Work Programme for 2021. And Patsy is going to be presenting on this item, and then Neil is going to be giving us, Neil Hayes from the Local Enterprise Partnership is going to be giving us an update on the digital work stream. But can I turn to you, Patsy, in the first instance?
Thank you, Chairman. And if you and other leaders are happy, what I suggest I do is work through section by section, enabling discussion after each section, hand over to Neil, and then take the recommendations at the end. If you're happy, that feels like the more efficient way to perhaps gain the feedback that we need on this item, if you're happy to do that. Okay, so this report provides a more in-depth update on a number of areas of Growth Board work. There is an overview of the work programme attached at Appendix 1, which has rolled forward to September, providing information across the range of Growth Board programmes that we're working on at the moment. If I start with the initial engagement with government section, obviously we've had the budget since the last growth board and some key announcements, including obviously 37.5 million to Stevenage through the Towns Fund deal, which we've all been absolutely delighted to hear about. There's been the announcement of the Levelling Up Fund, £4.8 billion there, and the creation of the National Infrastructure Bank and other measures, all of which are of interest to the Growth Board. As leaders will know, at 10:50 we have we'll be ending the Growth Board meeting and moving into a separate briefing with MHCLG for them to talk to us about direction of government policy and investment and support as part of Building Back Better. Leaders will be aware of a number of other funding announcements, Community and Renewal Fund, Welcome Back Fund. There have been quite a few since the budget, and clearly these are prioritised and have criteria attached to them. We've moved very much into from a single pot type approach into a very competitive range of initiatives bidding process, but there are opportunities for Hertfordshire here, and Growth Board and partners really need to think about how we coordinate that bidding and support that process. Growth Board can clearly help with that. The LEP has had expertise previously in bids to government and has a good process in-house that they, I understand, may be able to lend some support to this. My suggestion is that the Growth Board steering group, which includes Neil Hayes from the LEP, works with the Chief Execs group to make sure we are coordinating these bids in a timely fashion, and that we take that away and come back with a proposal for that. But we will need to know sort of where districts are in their thinking on the bids that they're considering at the moment. So that would be my suggestion, that we act as a kind of coordinating position, but with districts indicating where they're looking to bid as we go forward. So,
Patsy, thanks for that. Can I invite any comments from colleagues? I think I've had the opportunity to have a couple of discussions with MPs in the last week, and I think we're going to find some MPs have a very clear idea of opportunities that they see potentially available to support and which they're very eager to take forward. Others, I think, may want to reflect on local initiatives, discussions that they have with district and borough councils, maybe reflecting on what some of the projects that Hertfordshire County Council has identified in the area growth and transport plans, which might indicate specific opportunities. My sense is that even though Hertfordshire has been categorised as partly in Category 2 and partly in Category 3, MPs have been encouraged to develop bids alongside local government, particularly bids under 10 million. Which they feel will potentially gather support from the funding departments, but particularly MHCLG, who are coordinating this. But I'd welcome colleagues' views. Linda, I can see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, David. Just to confirm, really, I had a meeting with the MP for Bishops Stortford and Hertford on Friday, and she again confirmed that she was being encouraged to put in bids, even though we were 2 and 3 categories, and that they would be viewed favourably. So I think we do need to make sure that we have a degree of, shall we say, how can we get the best out of these bids across Hertfordshire, but with a degree of local flavour, which obviously will be good for all of us to ensure that residents understand what we can get and how we can do it. Thank you.
And Linda, I'd just add that I've also had the chance to speak to Julie Marsden, the MP for Hertford and Stortford, and one of the things I've shared with her is the East and South East growth and travel plan, because again, that's indicative, for instance, of where there may be gaps in cycle routes or highway schemes, and so there's an opportunity there for her to consider whether there's anything that particularly she feels that she wants to support. Now, the other important thing in all of this is the capacity and the skills that Hertfordshire has got in the local enterprise partnership. The LEP has been really successful in terms of the bids that it's submitted over the years for growth funding and the build, and most recently the Build Back Better fund, where Hertfordshire secured over 16 million, specifically identifying projects that were going to be delivered in the very, very short term. So we need to bring together those skills in order to respond to these opportunities, bring our MPs on board, and make sure that we secure some really valuable investments. I've got a couple of other hands up. I've got Mark, the chairman of the Local Enterprise Partnership, and Sharon Taylor from Stevenage.
Yes, good morning, colleagues. Thank you, David. I was just going to reinforce what you just said, but in a slightly different way, because we don't want to be seen as self-serving. I think this is more about the county has a capability here. We've developed this very well. We used it to good effect alongside the team in Stevenage to get, top dollar from the Towns Fund. And as you know, there is a review of how we operate going forward with the changing policies to how funds will be allocated through to local government rather than through LEPs. But I just think we just need to, as you've said, just take stock of this, make sure that we are really using this to good effect. There's clearly a resourcing implication going forward, which we need to resolve. But if I can encourage that Chief Executives group with Neil, as Patsy has recommended, to do that. And then if Neil needs to bring some things to the LEP board for agreement to get alongside that, then we'll clearly discuss that. But we just don't want to fritter away what we've spent 10 years building. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Sharon?
I absolutely agree with Mark. We've worked really hard on this in Hertfordshire, and we had, a Herts Growth Board plan. We've got a local industrial strategy that ought to sit properly alongside each other because we've worked together on them. And it would be interesting to know from the government's perspective what the overarching strategy is from them. Is this going to be mainly focused on housing? Is it going to be on the economy? And I think it'd be interesting to ask those questions perhaps of John McManus, if where the key focus of this is going to be. And there are inevitably going to be some overarching themes like recovery and like climate change, for example. All the work we've done has all that running all the way through it, so that's great for us. And I think looking at some more specific things, I think the from the North East Central cluster, the cell and gene therapy, as well as the work Martin's doing on town centres, all of this is, it seems to me, going in exactly the direction the government will want it to. But we don't really know that because we haven't, that they talk differently from different departments about different things. And I don't get the sense of any sort of overarching strategy here about what's going to be prioritised. And that's what we really need to know, because if you're bidding, you need to know which boxes to tick. Sorry to be crude about it, but that is the truth. So I hope we can get a sense of that. And, to what extent are those overarching themes going to play into this? And I was thinking about the place and movement strategy we looked at County Council a couple of weeks ago. There's loads of fantastic stuff in there that would really help make a dramatic change in terms of the climate change agenda, but also, just the living streets and all those kind of things that are really important to people. That works for high streets as well as residential areas. So I think there's we need to understand where government's focus is going to be, but we have worked really hard here in Hertfordshire to make sure we've got everything in line to deliver for the recovery, and I hope we're able to do that, and hope we get funding support to do it.
Thanks, Sharon. So I think there's a key role for leaders to play in terms of engagement with local MPs, and to be supported in that by the Chief Executives Group and by the work of Patsy and Mark and Neil at the LEP. So there's just a real need for some very close coordination over the coming weeks to make some important progress. Yes, we'll learn from MHCLG after this meeting in terms of their feedback on what sort of projects are going to be funded. Some of the levelling up, the source of some of the levelling up funding has come from the Department for Transport, for instance, and so there will undoubtedly be some expectation that projects have some contribute to transport infrastructure. The other key thing to recognise, of course, is that there are some MPs whose constituencies cross boundaries, and so an example would be Bim Afilami, who represents part of his constituency is in St Albans City and District, and part of it is in North Herts. North Herts is Category 2, St Albans is Category 3. You know, there are some complications there that we need to work through, but you know, above all, we must view this as an opportunity and to be really collaborative and constructive in terms of trying to secure the most sensible and the best possible contribution to our infrastructure. So if there's nothing else on the recent budget announcements and the funding streams, Patsy, can we move on to the housing stream?
Yep.
Work stream.
Thank you, Chair. So delivering the Homes Hertfordshire needs is one of our key work streams for this year. This update reflects the investigation into the feasibility of becoming a strategic partner with Homes England. It was one of the actions we identified in December and then in the work programme. There has been guidance issued on this, and I've put the links in the paper. The first stage in that would be to submit an expression of interest to become a strategic partner, but clearly there's a fair bit of due diligence work that would need to be undertaken to make sure that this is the right thing for the Hertfordshire councils. And I've put an extract in there of local authorities as a strategic partner with Homes England and what some of the key requirements are in terms of the headline number of homes that would need to be delivered. And this would be over the next 6-year period. We've a team working on this. We've brought in some housing consultants to help us with it. And we're looking at the criteria very, very closely to see whether or not there's the opportunity to put together a creative bid between stockholding councils, those councils that have got their own affordable housing delivery programmes, to see whether we meet the criteria. There would need to be a lead body, but there is the opportunity for other councils to be delivery partners. So we're looking at it very closely. It may be that the criteria don't work for Hertfordshire, but it will help us to see whether or not the alternative, which is continuous market engagement, which a number of councils do anyway with Homes England, might be a better prospect. But it's very clear there's £7 billion held by Homes England for investment in housing. We absolutely need to make sure that we are putting forward any good prospects and programmes for Hertfordshire to try and be able to get that support for bringing that housing forward. However, because of the publication of the guidance, it's not been totally clear when the window for submission of expressions of interest is. We're working, but we expect that to be before the next growth board on the 22nd of June. So you'll see from the paper, and I'm not being deliberately vague, it is just we're having to work through this feasibility. We need to ask if leaders are happy to agree some flexibility to be able to deal with this offline as we work through the feasibility with your teams, to be able to, if we get to the point where the submission of an expression of interest appears to be in the interests of Hertfordshire, to be able to agree that offline with the leaders of the councils who would definitely need to be a part of this, perhaps under the lead of Councillor Andrew Williams and Claire Hamilton as the lead chief execs, but with perhaps email support of all the rest of the board. That might be the way that we may have to do this if that's the window for submission. But if it makes sense for Hertfordshire, it should definitely be something that we should think about going for. But at this point in time, I can't give you the total assurance on whether it makes sense or not. But as soon as we've got a view one way or another, then obviously we'll let everybody know. So that's where we are really with that particular part of the work stream.
Okay, thanks, Patsy. And I think it's probably just worth highlighting that in addition to the 3 stockholding councils, the county council is the county council's plans and strategy for later living could potentially be included in any total of affordable housing that was being brought forward under these partnership arrangements. And so if we do need to aspire to deliver 1,500 grant funded homes by the 31st of March, for instance, some of those could be extra care type accommodation. Some of them could be some of the facilities for the accommodation for the homeless. There's a wider range than simply social need housing that's could be developed by the three stockholding authorities. So, Andrew, I don't know if you or Claire want to comment, but are you happy to be taking this forward, and that we may need to make decisions by email rather than at our next meeting?
Yes, Dave, I'm quite happy to take it forward in the way that's been suggested. I think it is something we need to investigate, but obviously it's something that we need to be content that it works for us before we actually commit. Yeah,
and obviously in terms of delivering at least 1,500 homes, that's quite a hurdle. But as I say, it could extend to the very significant investment that the County Council is looking to make in terms of social need extra care type accommodation. OK, well, we'll come back to the recommendations at the end. Shall we then, Patsy, go to the investment work stream?
Thank you, Chair. Not very much to say here, really. The paper outlines the scope of the suggested work stream. Leaders heard me say very similar things at their meeting last Thursday. So it's really, if there are any other comments, you'll now have seen that we have actually confirmed the specific times for the workshops down to 2 hours. So they're no longer holds in everyone's diary. They're confirmed appointments now as a result of that. So freeing up a little bit of time for you, hopefully. So that's all really to say, and answer any questions, or if anyone else has got anything else they want to see in scope, please let me know.
Any other comments on the investment work stream, colleagues? If not, governance, Patsy?
Thank you. As you know, we matured the governance of the Growth Board last year, and now in our second meeting as a statutory joint committee, and have made that transition successfully. I hope you'd all agree. It was always an ambition of the Growth Board to extend its reach and involvement of a wider set of partners. From the 2018 start of this meeting, you'd always had that ambition. And there are other bodies such as Health, Higher and Further Education, Homes England, government agencies and departments that it had been identified would be useful to be co-opted members of the Growth Board. The integrated governance framework, and there's an extract from that in the paper, provides for co-opted members to be added to the Growth Board as and when felt appropriate. Voting clearly would remain unchanged as originally set up with this statutory joint committee. So leaders are asked, are there any other bodies? Do you want to do this at this time? Are there other bodies than those that have been identified in the paper that you would like inviting? And then really a steer on to the June meeting or September.
OK, so first and foremost, I should share with colleagues, and I think I've had the opportunity to share this previously, but just to confirm that as we see the integrated care system across Hertfordshire, the so-called ICS, across Hertfordshire and West Essex mature, and as the arrangements in the recent NHS white paper come forward and are formalised, I have asked Paul Burstow, who's the independent chair of the Hertfordshire and West Essex integrated care system, to join the Growth Board at some stage, recognising the importance of the role that health plays and place plays in terms of the lives of our residents. And Paul has indicated that he'd be very pleased to join the Growth Board. So we then need to think about those other elements, and in Patsy's report, higher and further education was highlighted, government agencies, and Homes England were also highlighted. I'm very conscious that in the local enterprise partnership, we have, as part of its governance, formalised the arrangement whereby there is, in effect, a permanent representative from the University of Hertfordshire, who's currently Julie Newland, who sits on the Herts LEP, and then the principals of the 4 Hertfordshire further education colleges rotate in terms of their participation on the local enterprise partnership, as well as being involved in some of the extended governance arrangements and the other boards and groups that sit within the ambit of the local enterprise partnership. So I'm conscious that we don't want to necessarily double dip, given that we have that representation, but I'd welcome colleagues' views on other representatives that we should be looking to have sitting on the growth board. Almost inevitably, one that is always in our focus in terms of infrastructure is transport, and whether it makes sense either to have somebody from DFT or potentially from England's economic heartland, which has the link to DFT as a subnational transport body, an informal subnational transport body. But I'd welcome colleagues' thoughts on any specifics. And then the other thing that Patsy is asking us to determine is whether any new membership should take effect from June or take effect from our meeting in September. Given that we've got the elections, the county elections in May and some district and borough elections in May, I have to say that I think it makes sense to do it in September rather than June. I think June is going to be a little bit early, given that there may be some changes in leaders at that time. So that would be my view, to bring these arrangements into effect in September. But I'd welcome colleagues' views and opinions on that. Lewis Cocking, the leader of Borough of Broxbourne.
Thank you, David. I mean, I'm happy to have all of these other members on the board. I definitely think it's the best way forward. I mean, from Broxbourne's perspective, I would really like the higher education colleges on here, probably more important than for us than the University of Hertfordshire. I mean, we do have high levels of deprivation in Broxbourne, and this board is all about creating growth and jobs and prosperity, and if we don't give our residents the right skills to be able to access that through the higher education colleges, then we're going to have people commuting in and out of Hertfordshire on a large scale, and our residents are going to miss out. So I would really strongly support the colleges coming onto this, because I think it squares that circle in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of growth and jobs, and it will allow us to tap into the things like when we ask government for our growth deal, we want to add adult education budget and that into that, and that will feed into that quite nicely from our view, and I think it supports what we try and do here in Broxbourne.
Yeah, I think you mean particularly the further education colleges rather than higher education. When we think about higher education, we think about the university. So further education, so for instance, Tony Medhurst from Herts Regional College is, I think, what you got in mind there, Lewis.
Yeah, that's exactly it, because I think if we don't tap into that and we don't allow our residents to access that more and square that circle, as I said, for us, look, the university is an important key player, but for us, I think it's those colleges which you've just mentioned there, David.
Okay, yeah. I've got hands up from Chris White, the leader of St Albans, and Mark Breton from the Local Enterprise Partnership, but Chris first.
Thank you. Yeah, I think September makes sense, because there's a slight danger that we're going to run before we can walk. There's quite a lot of agencies out there where we want to touch base with them, but we don't necessarily want them on the board. The obvious one is police, because whilst police is an indirect participant in growth, their views from time to time are significant. The absolute missing link here, and you mentioned transport, but it's actually railways, isn't it? Because in many ways the county council can cover off the transport side, but rail is a very significant factor here in a number of places. But how you bring rail in, I'm not sure, and I just wonder, and this is one of the reasons why I think we should go for September, whether we need to explore some sort of broader contact group, so not people organisations on the board, but people with which the board engages routinely when developing plans, and that could be I hate to say second tier because that's not what I'm really saying, but those which have an interest but not a vital interest in what we're doing. And maybe that rail goes there. Equally, you could argue that rail is so important that it should be some sort of way of representing it on the board. But quite what entity would do that effectively, I don't know.
Yes, not at least because you've got the train operating companies as well as Network Rail itself, and you make a very valid point, Chris, in terms of the sort of wider groupings. And I'm going to turn to Mark in a second, but. What colleagues may not appreciate is that as far as the local enterprise partnership is concerned, there is the main board, but there's also then a series of focused boards, such as the Skills and Enterprise board, which is very focused on a certain aspect of the LEP's responsibilities and extends the reach of those participating to other businesses, other agencies, other public sector forums come into those arrangements, so that an example would be the HR director of Hertfordshire County Council sits on the Skills and Employment group of the LEP, for instance. Mark, did you want to pick up this point in terms of reach and some of the areas that we should be looking to involve?
Yeah, thank you, David. I think we're in danger of looking like a joined-up team, you and me, on this topic, on some of these topics, because and Lewis, to be fair, you haven't had the opportunity to do a stint on the LEP board yet. I think the points that David's made are very important to us, because the prime form and function of the LEP, as well as having been involved in local growth fund programs, which is likely to change, is skills and jobs, and the links between FEHE, business, and the county, with the skills advisory panels, the work we do with the Careers and Enterprise Company. David's mentioned the skills board. You've seen the work we've done with Adrian in some of the work with Gillian Keegan and apprenticeships. I'll be very concerned that if we're not careful, we're going to end up with a LEP and a growth board that look very much the same. And I think it's important that we work out over the summer period, and I think September is a good point to review that, for two reasons. Clearly, there's the domestic arrangements that you have as leaders, but also, as I presented at the leaders with Neil last week, we are running a review of the role of LEPs in the light of the policy change. The likely outcome is that it will increase our role in skills and business support. And if we've got some gaps in here which leaders perceive, then we should be trying to fill those in the revised form, fit and function of LEPs rather than duplication. So my recommendation would be, let's have a good look at this if there's an issue. If leaders don't think that in some cases they're getting what they need, the transparency or whatever it is, that we can fix that. But this is the lifeblood of what the LEP brings to the county. And I wouldn't want to recreate that twice, to be honest. It's very inefficient.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Linda.
Yeah, thank you. It's just to confirm David and Mark's views that actually we have to be very careful that we're not the same people sitting around the same table in different titles. The LEP does do an awful lot of what Lewis and others have said. And I think perhaps going with Chrissy's idea of having informal, perhaps focus groups or gatherings over certain topics to bring people of a much broader basis together may be the way to go forward. Later in the agenda, we are looking at setting up a developers forum, which again is bringing in different groups but who have a major role to play within the success of Hertfordshire. So perhaps that's how we need to do it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think, and we'll come back to this in the recommendations, but I think there's a steer, Patsy, that we'd like you to do some further work in terms of identifying those who could usefully either join the board as co-opted members or be part of the within the orbit of the growth board in some shape or form. Maybe we discuss that again in June, at our meeting in June, but with a view then to bringing in people like Paul Burstow, for instance, at our meeting in September. Okay, let's move on to just a quick update on communications, Patsy.
Thank you, Chair. We had, in the last period, successful internal briefing webinar on the 12th of March, which has now been, the YouTube recording of that has now been sent out to everybody. Good attendance. We had 130 people pretty much for the whole 2 hours. So I hope you've had feedback from exec members and senior officers that they found that useful. It was very much aimed at those closer to the growth board, but the plan is to do something for the rest of the local government family who have obviously contributed by supporting the governance of the joint committee, for example, through your council meetings last year, but have been slightly detached from knowing what's happening with the growth board. So they would be our next priority, and then clearly we've worked to do with MPs and communities on what's happening with the growth board. But that's pretty much what I want to say about communications at the moment. Everything else is in the paper. Thank you.
Okay, so if there's no additional comments on that, can we move on to the digital work stream and the update from Neil Hayes from the Local Enterprise Partnership?
Thank you, Chair. I've got some slides which I'll just pull together. Doesn't seem to be working at the moment, so that's the wrong one.
Here we go.
No, I think this is the wrong one. Apologies. If I'll just start talking, and if I can locate the presentation, I will do. So essentially, on the back of the last meeting, members were asking for an update in terms of the digital work stream. So back in the autumn, we held a workshop with representatives from districts and county and some partners such as the university and private sector players such as BT and Ocado, just to understand how we start framing this piece of work going forward. Essentially, the biggest task was understanding the kind of infrastructure piece and where we needed to go in relation to that. And so that's been the lion's share of the work, as it were. Hopefully you can see this now.
Yeah, that's fine, Neil, thanks.
So in terms of the big piece of work that we've undertaken on the back of that steer was a market engagement exercise. So over kind of January, February time, myself and Anna Morrison from the County Council, who leads on kind of digital activity, and other colleagues met with 14 fibre carriers and 3 mobile operators. So I think bar O2, the vast majority of the key players in the industry. And essentially it was a way to have a dialogue, understanding their investment plans, what the barriers are to investment, what should be doing as a place to attract further investment. And also we were looking at other places and seeing where we were. So there's a report that's currently being drafted, and obviously we'll share that with the growth board as soon as that's in a fit state. I'm keen to stress that this is not an all singing, all dancing digital strategy. This is focusing on the tasks at hand that will evolve into other work streams. But in terms of where we've got to in terms of key findings, obviously, there's a separation between sort of superfast broadband and fibre, which is, as a county with the last sort of big programme in terms of getting broadband into the county, which we were involved in an investment basis. The take up in the county has been very high on super fast broadband, so kind of up to 30, 50 megabit speeds. And in terms of, there are still places that don't, particularly in the east of the county, but the take-up has been relatively strong. In terms of full fibre, however, other than St Albans, which has had recent investment, we're well below the national average of 18, and I'll show some of the stats on this in a second. And actually, having spoken to all the various providers, there is a kind of issue in relation to the fact that Virgin Media is ever present in Hertfordshire, and that, whilst is a positive, when we're talking about full fibre stroke gigabit investment in infrastructure, it's kind of a discouragement from other providers into Hertfordshire. So you might have seen City Fibre announce a number of town investment and city investments over the past couple of weeks, none of those in Hertfordshire. And there does seem to be an issue of, because Virgin is so prevalent, not all of that Virgin infrastructure is gigabit, and Virgin themselves recognise they need to diversify the way their customers can access full fibre. But there's an issue here which we need to get underneath. There is, however, an interest in investing, and fibre carriers, once they understand the kind of, particularly the future growth trajectory, so they're interested in obviously garden town developments, particular sector investments and the digital requirements that are going to be needed there that they weren't getting. So there is an issue about making sure that we're providing that information to them. And there are also, there are government funding pots, which I'll talk about shortly, which we need to gear ourselves around. So part of the work, this is looking at sort of similar sort of home counties in southern England, and FTP is full fibre to the premise. So that is basically, it's not what you have at the moment, which is digitally enabled green boxes and then copper wire bringing it to the homes. This is full fibre to the premise, and as you can see, the percentage of full fibre to the premise in Hertfordshire is particularly low compared to some of our neighbouring areas. And then if you look at how much of that is gigabit capable, so gigabit is a shorthand for next generation broadband. It's the kind of, so if you can get up to 100 meg, you're talking 1,000 meg plus speeds, which post 2025 is going to be a real issue in terms of the need to have that in place. It's almost like a switch from analog to digital. This is what all the government investment is about, trying to accelerate that investment post 2025. But also you can see, I've overlaid the information around Virgin Media, and you see whether there's a point here in the fact that we have such high Virgin Media coverage that there is this issue that we need to address. I mean, it's not exclusively so. You can see we put Slough in on purpose simply because they are very high in terms of full fibre to the premise and gigabit and have Virgin Media, but there's not a kind of monopoly of provision. So that is an issue which we need to invest. So government policy, there are a plethora of announcements over in the last week or so in terms of investments from government. Outside in is about the final 20% of areas that are not getting adequate broadband provision. We are part of a process that includes other adjacent areas in the east of England. In this process, we launched in spring 2021. We need to make sure that we are sort of front and centre of that programme moving forward. There's also funding pots available for public sector sites in that final 20% in terms of broadly rural areas. And it's anticipated those projects would be probably addressed at a county level. So there's an opportunity for us to work, identify sites and pull in further bids to DCMS. And then another one announced recently was around gigabit vouchers. This is about enabling individuals or businesses to apply for a voucher to gain access to gigabit fibre or a wireless connection. So either a 4G plus or 5G connection. And so, again, we need to be making sure that those vouchers are being used in Hertfordshire, and particularly those areas of missing links. I think the other thing to add is that there is increasingly, we're seeing investment from other parts of the country, but the public sector themselves are making. So, for example, the Liverpool City region have just announced a joint venture with a digital infrastructure provider to to put fibre spine networks across the city. So an investment around 30 million. So in essence, they'll be we want to invest and other areas in what model that could be in terms of is there potential to own the asset rather than just get public funding to kind of alleviate or accelerate infrastructure. So we're currently working through the next steps. I think this for me is a clear area where, as a growth board, now that we have the growth board, that level of sponsorship and ownership need to be from kind of this level. A perception was that from some of the providers that it was only based on their last interaction with a particular authority, and if that interaction was good, then they thought the whole of Hertfordshire were good, and vice versa. So there needs to be something around, as part of this attractiveness as a place for investment. What do we stand for as a place in terms of policies and strategies that encourage investment? That we are making sure that we're prioritising infrastructure, digital infrastructure investment, that we are moving barriers to growth of digital infrastructure. So almost like and other areas have a kind of like a open and transparent concordat or a policy which is all about, if you invest in this infrastructure, these are the things we will do as a place. So that is clearly necessary. We want to do some more market engagement, and we're talking about potentially a kind of a market information day to promote Hertfordshire and attract investment and actually bring more people into the dialogue within the auspices of the Growth Board, as a way of maintaining the interest. The engagement exercise was really well received by some of those providers, and that's now led to further conversations where they are talking about interest in localities and places for potential investment. So we want to make sure that's clearly built in. I think the other areas around, as we move to the next iteration of the recovery plan, to make sure that the infrastructure piece is woven into other areas, about making sure that the issues around digital divide and inclusion are addressed, and that move to online sort of learning and training, etc., are brought in. So moving to that wider digital strategy and building on the success of places like the DIS in the east of the county and with Essex authorities, that is a very good model which we should be looking to exploit elsewhere. Clearly, there are pots of funding which we need to bid for in a joined up and coordinated way. I think we're not utilising those as well as we could. And I think there's obviously a further sort of strand of work around the role of the public sector in terms of the asset base, in terms of sites and locations, using digital infrastructure on the back of that, and obviously transformations in service delivery. So it could go in lots of different ways, and we want to make sure that the digital strategy ultimately touches all those areas. But ultimately, if we don't have the enabling infrastructure or a plan to address that, then the rest of it doesn't come together. So that's the priority. We'll have a plan hopefully in the next couple of weeks to be able to share amongst Growth Board colleagues, and then hold a separate session so we can have a more in-depth conversation about where we go next. And that's where I'd like to finish, Chair.
Neil, thank you for that. Can I invite any comments or observations, colleagues? Linda.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, it's I just want to say thank you to Hertfordshire County Council, because they have now joined the DIS. So I think that is a very important step forward to making sure that the whole of Hertfordshire, not just the east of the districts, actually work very closely with the county and benefit from the work that has already been done. So absolutely great.
Okay, any other colleagues want to come in on this? This is really a very important agenda. I have to say that, given the focus that we've previously had on extending superfast to rural areas, and have been quite successful in that, it does come as a real eye-opener in terms of the gigabit, the lack of gigabit capacity in the county, and the implications potentially of the ubiquity of Virgin Media, and what that does or what that doesn't, more importantly, give us. I've got Lewis from Brockbourne indicating, and Sharon from Stevenage. Lewis.
I mean, just to follow on from what Linda has said, I mean, the DIS does some fantastic work in terms of getting the high fibre broadband. I mean, we've had some success in Broxbourne with working with some of our doctors' surgeries to make sure they can do stuff more online. I think obviously now with COVID, we don't know what's here to stay. Are some doctors' consultations still going to be done online? Are some meetings like this still going to be done online? And I think it's going to unlock the economy even more in Hertfordshire. So fully support the work of what we're trying to do here and what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I'd add, Lewis, that the example of taking fibre to the premise of a doctor's surgery enables you then to hang on other links to that fibre spine, and all of a sudden it's a way of reaching out. And when Neil was talking about the public sector potentially making some investments in the more rural parts of Hertfordshire, again, it's that sort of spine type theory that you then hang off links into villages or residences on the back of the public sector investment that you're making. I've got Sharon, then Chris and Mark. Sharon.
Thank you, David. That chart that Neil had in his presentation is very stark, and that's why I think this should be an absolutely top priority for us, because the kinds of the two main clusters we've got in Hertfordshire, economic clusters of creative industries and cell and gene therapy, rely very heavily on high quality digital infrastructure. And as we develop I appreciate the rural issues, and that's very important for us as well. But as we develop the town centre programme, those areas that are going to have flexible working space, if they're going to work, they need very high quality digital infrastructure, as do the other projects that we're proposing. If you think about the biotech centre that we've just got funded in Stevenage Town Centre through the Towns Fund deal, that will all need this high level of digital infrastructure. It's vital, as important. It'd be like setting up a company with no electricity, or it's as important as that. So I'm grateful for the presentation and the work that's gone into it. I think we have to really have an absolute laser-like focus on this. Otherwise, we will lose ground to those other areas that have already got the higher infrastructure. And whatever we have to do to get over this, this issue about Virgin Media, we've got to get a grip of that and sort it out and make this a top priority for us.
Just before going to Chris and Mark, can I just ask Neil or Patsy, in terms of the plan that Neil, you and Anna Morrison are bringing forward, does the plan address how we need to resource our management of this particular issue?
Not in the current draft, but that's one of the issues that we're currently discussing. It clearly needs some kind of management resource, and also the bit of work I want to do before we share the draft is understand the art of the possible in terms of potential investment. So, even as the lab potentially investing in infrastructure, if that then provides a return that can help for the resource, a modest return even, to provide a resource to keep the kind of work behind this going, that's something that we want to sort of look at relatively swiftly. So I'll give you an example. One of our LEPs in the south, his Enterprise M3, have invested £4.5 million in fibre infrastructure, which will provide a modest return for them to have, for example, to pay for a digital advisor, for example. So there's not huge amounts of funding, but at least it's providing some kind of sustainable resource to do other things on the back of it. So that's the type of thing which particularly some of our board members are keen for me to have a look at in the context of the LEP. But obviously, if the scale is relatively large, then we're probably talking significant amounts of money. I know that obviously the Merseyside one is large at 30 million, but I think there is this notion of a bit of local investment matched with some DCMS funding would then attract and accelerate the private investment. So that combination of the three, I think, would work really well.
Thanks, Neil. Chris, then Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I found the presentation quite chilling, actually, and I think we need to be really quite scared about the nature of the competition from elsewhere, which is not necessarily the traditional places. Hertfordshire, for instance, were talking about 100% superfast broadband 10 years ago. And if you find you can run a fintech company in the rolling hills of Hertfordshire, staring at a cow during lunchtime, there's a lot of attraction there, and therefore we have more competitors than we had before. Sharon's entirely right about the sectors we're dealing with, which are particularly broadband and dependent. I think I agree about rural, but we mustn't forget that the weakness is still actually in town centres. I mean, there are blank spots in the middle of St Albans. I've got a whole street in my rather urban division which has got broadband connection problems. So we are not really even on the first base in terms of solving this, and the more we do, the better. And I think we need to also resist the siren suggestion from some ministers that everyone wants to get back into the office desperately 5 days a week. I don't think that's going to happen. And therefore, we're talking about a mixed economy where the savings that we've all recognised from this sort of meeting, and I do wonder, as we go forward, whether we want to continue meetings like this if we're allowed to, which is a different issue, the savings that have been achieved in terms of time and efficiency will want to be exploited still. I mean, yes, you will need human contact. You will need to be gathering together and shooting ideas across the top of your computer in an office. But for doing it 5 days a week, I think it's unlikely. And therefore, we have got to make sure that it's not only firms, but also households which have got these facilities.
Thanks, Chris. Mark.
Yes, I think there's two things here. I think, first of all, if you look at the percentage of coverage from one organisation, I think that belies a question we should be asking about, which I think Neil's raised, which is, well, why is it not attractive to other organisations to invest and create some more competition? So I think that's a role for us in the LEP to help stimulate. I think the other thing I would like to do is just to bring us back to the previous conversation about skills. And if you look at what we're going to be requiring from people in terms of digital skills, it's very difficult to run an effective digital skills program for our population if the infrastructure isn't there. And so in some LEPs, we've created digital skills partnerships. Whether we decide to do that, work with the DIS and so on, I don't know. But I think we need to join this piece up between not just the infrastructure and business who might need it. I think to Chris's point around homes and so on, but it's our future generation as well who need to have that digital skills capability. And if you don't have that capability to run these things at home, then or in your schools, it's not going to work too well. So I think that's another piece of our puzzle we need to put into this.
Can I just add to that briefly? One of the sort of offshoots of the conversation, which has been really helpful, is the data sharing element of understanding where we both are as kind of the market and the public sector. So, for example, some of their investment decisions, that there are sort of blank spots on the map where they don't pick up things like permitted development activity, for example. So suddenly you have 30 residential connections, which wasn't on their map before because they just don't have the data to read through. So there are a number of issues we're uncovering from all of this that actually shine the Hertfordshire in a different light. I think the critical mass thing is an issue in the fact that it's easy to map out a spine fibre network on a city basis, but obviously Hertfordshire looks more complicated when in reality, when you look at the proximity of, say, St Albans to Watford, for example, in geographic terms, it's not. So there's a bit of myth busting that we need to do with the market around actually, you've got 1.2 million people here. You've got a significant amount, a third of the workforce going on to the point commuting into London. We had a really interesting conversation with colleagues at our London LEP who are all working on the basis, the common assumption is a 3-day working week now with 2 days working from home is where a number of partners are planning on, corporate and public sector. So that has implications for demands on the network, just keeping things as they are, let alone moving forward. So, it's a bit like unpeeling the onion. There's lots of things that are coming out of this, which we need to sort of put in a box and then work as a progress, which is probably going to be a resource issue. But again, we need to sort of get to a point where we at least understand where we need to go with this and have adequate resources in order to move forward.
Okay, Maurice, final word on this?
Yeah, I was just going to add. I'm sorry, I'm actually outside. It's so beautiful. I was hearing this 60-40 situation. from what I'm hearing, it may not also necessarily be 3 days on, 2 days off. It could well be 1 week on, 3 weeks off, for a certain number of days over the period of a year. So it may not be quite as simple as having a certain number of days a week. It will depend on the companies and on what people want to do. But I was speaking to my soon-to-be ex who works in London. They have Vodafone, huge offices down Liverpool Street, and they're looking at this 60-40, maybe the other way, 40-60 split. But she says it may not be, maybe 1 day a week, but then maybe 1 week a month. It all depends on the services they're providing, the staff needs, etc., and so on, and also the mental health and the well-being of the staff. So as I say, I don't think it's quite as clear as 3 days a week or 2 days a week.
Thanks, Maurice. Okay, so we've, in relation to this particular item on the agenda, we've got a series of recommendations that were on page 18 of the report, namely that we note the progress of the work programme, which I think is relatively straightforward, that we additionally note the current scope of the housing work stream and the work that's going to be done there, that the board notes and approves the scope of the investigatory work for the investment work stream. We've then got 9.4, that the board extends invite to organisations. So I think there, Patsy, whilst I think everybody would be content to extend an invitation to Paul Burstow, we do need to identify those other bodies and just think that through in relation to the LEP. And maybe at our June meeting, we can consider those individual stroke bodies identified, with a view then to having the more broadly constituted growth board kick off in September. And then can I ask that we have a final recommendation in relation to Neil's report, that we noted his report, we noted the next steps. We are awaiting the HCC LEP report. I'd like to think that we can consider that at our meeting in June. And it would be enormously helpful to have recommendations about the structure that we should be putting in place in order to manage this strategy. Again, thinking very carefully, we do need to reflect on the growth board's role in this versus the LEP's role in terms of this digital agenda. So some clarity on that when we come to our meeting in June, I think would be very helpful. Sharon, did you just want to come in on that?
Just very quickly, David, I just think the minute needs to say that we recognise the urgency of this issue and of making sure that we make progress quickly on it. And obviously we work with the LEP to do that, but I think we've all got to work together on this. It is really urgent and, you know, really important that we crack on and do it.
Thanks, Sharon. So are you content with that, Patsy?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. We'll make sure that's clear.
So can I just ask that we address this formally? There are 5 recommendations now that we've got at 9 on the order paper. Can I ask colleagues to indicate whether they are for, against or abstain? And for those monitoring, I'm not in chat at the moment, but I would vote for. So I think, Stephanie, we're there at the moment. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. OK, so I am very conscious that it's just after 10:30 and we've got our briefing with MHCLG starting at 10:50. So if we can get through the remainder of the agenda pretty quickly, that would be great. Patsy, you're going to introduce agenda item number 5, establishing a Hertfordshire Developers Forum and the options available to us.
Thank you, Chair. I think given time, I'll take the paper as read and just ask for feedback if leaders are content with the approach that I've suggested.
And forgive me, Patsy, did you make a recommendation as to whether this should be developer funded or growth board funded? My preference would be the former, I have to say, rather than the public sector spending money on this. I'm sure that the developer community would be prepared to finance this. Did your recommendation go either way on that?
I think my suggestion would be the sort of middle ground between, so a co-designed model with developer funding, and take soundings after this meeting and bring a formal proposition back to June.
Okay, that's great. Colleagues, any comments? Mark, is that a legacy or?
No, that's me again, I'm afraid. Yeah, I just think given our collective investment amongst a number of councils and the LEP in the enterprise zone, and our interest in attracting people with the modern methods of construction capabilities, I'd just like to see that brought out, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had conversations at various times, Mark, with Top Hat and McCarthy and Stone, who are now very committed. Sorry?
You don't look old enough for McCarthy and Stone.
But they are themselves very coming to the fore in terms of modern methods of construction. So it does highlight to me that there are great opportunities not only to discuss how the county is evolving and important things like infrastructure, but also the question of modern methods of construction and off-site manufacture. Lewis, and then Peter Taylor, the Mayor of Watford.
Yep, thank you, David. Just briefly, I mean, I support your sentiments on this. I think developers should burden the full cost of this. They've got deep pockets and they often get away with not paying their fair share when it comes to local government and infrastructure. So I definitely think we should be pushing for them to pay and not a penny from us. But thank you.
OK, thanks, Lewis. Peter, and then Maurice Bright.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure other colleagues are the same. We've had a developers forum in Watford for many years that's worked really well. And I think it would be good to just review the nuts and bolts of how that works, because I can take on board David and Lewis's point about funding. But actually, there's not, from my experience, there aren't huge costs associated with this. I think it'd be good just to look at what's happening at a district level and build on that.
OK. Maurice.
Yeah, thanks. Just want to be a little bit wary when we talk about developers meeting a cost from a perception point of view. Outside, well, look, they're going to get their way because they're funding all this kind of thing, and I think there needs to just be a little bit of a look about how we do things when it comes to perception and developers, because a lot of residents think that developers tend to get what they want. A bit of a developers charter going on, especially with government wanting to build as much as they do. And I don't want to think that things are a done deal because it's being paid for. So I think we need to find the right balance.
OK. If there is nobody else, so if there's nobody else, the recommendations, were there specific recommendations, Patsy?
It was for feedback, and then for me to bring take some soundings with the industry and bring a worked up proposition back to June with a view to the first meeting later in the year.
Yeah, I've got it now at 6.1 and that item, page 27. So if I can ask colleagues whether they're for, against or abstaining, please. And again, from my position, Stephanie, I'm for. OK, that recommendation's agreed. So we're going to move on to agenda item number 7, the update on the review of the Hertfordshire Infrastructure and Planning Partnership. Linda, are you going to present this item for us?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. As most of you know, the Hertfordshire Infrastructure Planning Partnership, HIP, has been in existence for many years and has indicated in the paper, provided some major reports across Hertfordshire, which have been of value to all of us in putting our district plans and local plans together. We had a bit of a navel gaze when the Growth Board was first sort of established, and decided that actually HIP still had a role to play, because the Growth Board needs to look at the strategic aspects. HIP goes into the nitty-gritty. We then had another navel gaze when the nature of the Growth Board changed into this formal body, and it was felt, we had an extensive discussion at the last HIP meeting, where members again felt that actually HIP was there to service the Growth Board in providing infrastructure studies which would be of value to us. We had already had and also it was the main forum where planning portfolio holders and also planners could get together to share experience and also requests. I think our ask in this is that I wanted to make it a more formal relationship between what HIP was doing and the Growth Board. Therefore, I have suggested that HIP provides updates to the Growth Board, and working in conjunction with the climate change sustainability panel, because we're starting to get a lot of groups which are doing very similar but nuanced different activities. And also we need to look at the funding of HIP. The HCCSP has agreed funding for support officers, and again we need to do that with HIP, because at the moment it's being done through the planning officers. But if we're going to carry on doing this in a good way and a workable way, particularly with the Developers Forum, we need to make sure that we have sufficient capacity to actually get things done. And as we know, the infrastructure within Hertfordshire is critical if we are able to ensure that the growth that we are all aspiring to actually has legs to stand on, or even wheels to run around on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So any comments or feedback? We've got the recommendations at point 3 on the order paper of the agenda pack on page 36. If there are no comments, there were 3 recommendations that leaders note the paper attached to Appendix 1, agree that HIP continues to have a valuable role to play within the wider work of the Growth Board, and at 3.3 agrees to provide future Secretariat support to the Hertfordshire Infrastructure Planning Partnership meetings, which I take it, Patsy, you're content to oversee.
We'll find a way of organising that so it works. Yeah.
Okay. And so in the meantime, colleagues are voting for, and I'd add my own for vote to that. And so that's those recommendations are agreed. Thank you. Now, in my haste to get to the end of the agenda in time, I missed out point number 6 on the agenda, the Growth Board Work Programme and Corridor Programme Board updates. Linda and Sharon, was there anything that you particularly wanted to highlight to colleagues?
No, I think all the information that has been, I would have said, has already been in the report on the overarching activities of the Growth Board, so I won't go into it anymore, except to say that Friday night at 6 o'clock, I understand there will be champagne popping, because it will be actually the agreement signed for the HIG bid for 172 million, which gets the infrastructure going for Harlow, Gilston, Garden Town. So I would like to thank everybody on this call who actually has, it's been a pretty of a tricky journey, but actually it's got there within the correct time frame. So thank you all.
Yeah, and particularly I'd want to highlight the contributions of Richard and Patsy and all the meetings that they've had with MHCLG and equally with Essex and Places for People as well. So share a glass, as they would say, in terms of that. Sharon, have you got anything that you want to add in terms of the?
Sorry, just very briefly, we'd had some steps to take on the JSP front. We did a lot of work before the March meeting, and we've agreed the first step, which is to go out for tender for a growth study. So we're very pleased with the way that work's going now, and look forward to seeing what the growth study turns up in. That will be in autumn 2021. I think it is. I've got 22 on my papers, but I think it's 21. We're working on the science and technology programme, which is really going to be, I think, a fascinating exercise to do. And just lastly, one of the leading actions we took was for Linda and Matt to consider how best to develop the county-wide approach across both corridor boards with regard to progressing climate and sustainability issues with Julie Greaves and Mark Kemp. So lots going on. The rest is in the report, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks. So can I ask colleagues to note the recommendation at 5.1 on page 30 of the agenda pack that leaders note the project update at Appendix 1. So this is agenda item number 6. And again, Stephanie, I am voting for, please. And so that's unanimously confirmed. Thank you. And then the final item on the formal agenda is the standing item in relation to the South West Herts Joint Plan. Chris, a verbal update?
Yeah, we are about to make a step change, moving up a gear to creating a statement of common ground, the statutory statement of community involvement, a visioning engagement, and a Regulation 18 consultation. This will start after the elections. So a very important development, and that is also going to involve additional staffing. This has not yet been signed off. It will be signed off, one hopes, tomorrow at our meeting, but that is certainly what has been agreed in the background. I'm content with, and members will look at it tomorrow. So we're on our way.
Great, thanks, Chris. And so, colleagues, that concludes the formal part of our meeting. Just to highlight that our next meeting is planned for the 22nd of June at 4:30 p.m. We had been intending to do that by Teams, but as a formal committee, we are caught up in the debacle of remote and hybrid meetings, and so we will have to consider exactly how we're doing that, and whether, for instance, we're able to convene physically in County Hall, or indeed a larger venue like I know there's been some discussion about the Gordon Craig Theatre, for instance, but anyway, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So that concludes this part of the meeting. The broadcast will now conclude, and I would ask colleagues to use the same Teams link. So keep your Teams camera on, but take 5 minutes just to have a comfort break and grab a cup of coffee. And then we'll come back to the session with MHCLG at 10:50, but let's say 10:55, but using this Teams link. So thank you for your contributions this morning. And that concludes this meeting.